Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us for the webinar this evening, which has been hosted by AHDB. My name's Chloe McKee, and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb, and tonight we'll be discussing how to maintain cattle performance at grass. Our presenter this evening is Dr. Liz Jennifer, Independent Beef and Sheep Consultant. And the plan of action this evening is that Liz will take us through a 35-minute presentation, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. You will all be muted throughout the webinar, but if you'd like to ask a question, then please type it into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. Then when Liz is finished presenting, I'll ask these questions. If you can't see this box, click on the orange arrow to open it up, then click on the questions drop-down and you'll see where you can type your question in. You can type your questions in at any time throughout the webinar, and please also use this box to let us know if you're having any technical problems, and we'll do our best to help. So hopefully there won't be any technical difficulties tonight, but please bear with us if there are any. So Liz, I'll hand over to you for tonight's webinar.
Thank you very much, Chloe. So the plan of attack really for tonight is we're going to really be talking about growing and finishing cattle. So I'm not really going to be talking about calves with mothers or necessarily just sort of recently weaned dairy cross animals. It's mainly going to be growing and finishing animals. Obviously, if there's anything you want to cover on that, we can deal with them in questions, but the main presentation is on those types of animals. So what we're going to do this evening is go through talking about targets and then how to monitor that performance, what grazing strategies can be used for these systems, and then talk a bit about options to deal with quality and quantity issues, which I know this year is particularly interesting for. And we'll also talk about finishing cattle at grass, because that comes up quite a lot, and in terms of, so we'll have a specific question in terms of that. And then obviously, as Chloe said, we'll have time for questions at the end. So what we've got to think about in growing and finishing animals is we've got to think of these three phases. So rearing tends to be up to the point of weaning. So obviously in a suckler system, that can be 200 days for certain systems, up to sort of 10, 11 months, depending on the decision to wean. We then move through to this growing phase, and that can last up to 15 months. And that really is the aim of this, is to get good frame on those animals. So we're looking for frame growth rather than laying down fat during this stage. And that's where grass has its really important role in this growing phase. And then we're moving into this finishing phase, which tends to be a short, sharp period where we're trying to really maximize weight gain. And this is when we're trying to put fat cover on. So we've built the frame during the growing phase, and then during the finishing phase, we're trying to put fat onto it. What you can also see is that we have to also think, as well as those three distinct phases, we've also got to think of the types of animals that we've got on farm. So they're small framed, medium framed, or large framed, and that will be slightly driven by breed, but also sex or gender. And so if we think about sort of early maturing cattle, they tend to be the more traditional British breed, so Aberdeen, Angus, Hereford, depending on the sort of where they've come from. And we've also got later mature, or those larger framed animals that tend to be the more continental animals. Obviously there's a bit of variation, but with generalization, we're looking at British breeds being more early maturing, smaller framed animals, and the continentals being the late maturing, larger framed animals. So what we can also see with those smaller framed ones, they might not actually need to have a huge amount of finishing. They might actually finish lay down fat during that growing phase, as they generally have a greater ability to lay down fat. So in terms of planning that finishing phase, it leads into what frame size and also the gender of those animals. So similar, heifers may not need to be on a so-called finishing diet. They may also lay down enough fat during that growing period. But it's just, I find it useful just to visualize where those cattle are within those three phases and what is the potential of those animals based on their breed, frame size and gender. So we've also got to think about, and I'm channeling my inner Steve Powdrell, we've got to think about the target market. And so this is as important for when we're thinking about this sort of growing animal, and what is the target age in particular that we're interested in. So are we trying to finish it through that growing season into the autumn, or do we have more time and our ambition is to actually finish it in a shed? Are we also targeting a particular weight range? So where you're selling your animals, does it have a very specific weight specification? Also depends on whether you actually are trying to finish them or you're just trying to grow them into a heavier store situation. So really, you're trying to maximize weight gain off grass during that period. So you can see on the slide at the moment, that's up at the moment, we've got main markets, we've got those target ages in months, the gender, the carcass weight, and then the classification, both in terms of conformation and fat levels. So, and then just some guidance in terms of assuming a 54% killing out percentage, what those sort of carcasses would look like in terms of a live weight gain. So 250 kilo carcass is about 460 and 350 would be about 650 kilos of live weight. So as with anything we do, whether we also always got to think about what our target market is, and it helps us have a bit of a plan in terms of what do we need those animals to do over that grazing season. And then it links into this, which is, and these, you could have one or more of these, but what is the target? What are you trying to achieve with those animals in that growing phase? Is it live weight gain per day? And certainly within a lot of grazing systems, we should be able to achieve over 1 kilo per day, and we'll talk about why that varies over that season. That is certainly a realistic target. We can look at demand, and that we'll also talk about demand a bit as well, but that could be that in certain farmer systems, they want a proportion of their total sort of feed demand, so that's feed coming from grass and forages, to be in so-called trading stock, so animals that can be sold if feed is becoming limiting for other breeding animals. So we could also look at weight gain over the seasonal grazing days. So are we trying to target 200 days out at grass? And if we need to achieve 200 kilos of body weight gain, we obviously need to be doing it over 1 kilo a day. So that's sort of quite linked into what those daily performances are. Stocking rate, as some of you will know, my most hated question. So it's really linked into demand as well. What are we trying to achieve in those stocking rates? And I've got a table that may help or may not in terms of what livestock units or demand equates to in terms of animals per hectare or per acre. Are we looking at live weight gain per hectare? And so the ambition is greater than 500 kilos of gain per hectare over that season potentially. So, and that, what we have to remember, and it sort of comes back in, we'll also talk about it in the grazing strategies in a moment, is that when we're chasing per hectare performance, which generally means that we're increasing our stocking rate, individual performance might actually not be as high as it would be if we're reducing that stocking rate. So there's always this trade-off between individual performance, so live weight gain of that individual, potentially against what that performance is per hectare. And if we're really trying to push up per hectare performance, increase stocking rate, we may not get the individual performance we want, but at a per hectare level, we're going to be doing what we need in terms of targets. So it's just important to think about, are you targeting individual gain, or are you looking at per hectare performance? And also, some systems would also want a proportion of those animals sold by the autumn. There's not enough shed space for all of them. That's what the system relies upon. So it's also thinking about, we're trying to get live weight on those animals to get basically as much live weight sold off that farm as possible by the time the autumn comes, whether they're finished or not. But it's the target driven by shed space or wintering capacity. So what I should have said there, which is in terms of monitoring what's happening, obviously weighing is very important. We also know that weighing facilities on certain farms, well, don't exist, or they don't have those weighing capacities. So some people would be using weigh bridges to sort of do a trailer load start and end weight to get an idea of what they're doing. In an ideal, in certain systems, they would be doing a turnout weight, a mid-season weight, and sort of a housing weight to sort of get a range of what's happening. But what we see when people are weighing them more frequently, we get a bit of noise because they're weighing them more, and gut feel changes, and the order of which they're weighed will change that. But also you'll see that their response to certain factors, so grass quality, quantity, will affect that live weight quite significantly through that season, and we're not capturing that level of detail by weighing them maybe 3 times in that season. There are some opportunities to do some remote weighing, and so there are some kits out there that can do weighing in field attached to water troughs. But that, I think, will be the massive sort of sea change in terms of getting more performance off grass when we have greater levels of data capture remotely, ideally within fields, and quite frequent weighing events. So this slide is a bit busy, but I'll talk through it. So each column is a slightly different thing. So the first one is livestock units per hectare. The next one is demand kilos of dry matter per hectare. So some people would talk livestock units, and the advantage of that is that we can equate cows to sheep, and we can equate different systems in terms of livestock units. My preference at the minute is demand. So, and that means that because we can really quickly compare it with what grass growth is doing at the time, so we can see if pasture covers are likely to go up or down. We've then got the next two columns, which is 350 kilo cattle per hectare and per acre. It's basically how at one livestock unit, how that would be 2.3 sort of 350 kilo animals per hectare, or just one per acre. And then if those increase to 500 kilos, you'd be looking at about 1.5 per hectare, or about half a animal per acre. So that's sort of how we start to do a comparison between those different ways of explaining the stocking density of those animals. The other thing to think about is that, as we've just discussed, ever optimistically, those animals are always changing in weight. So that makes it also quite complex to sort of work out a stocking rate. And some people would sort of, similar to what you would do in a housing system, you would sort of pitch for the middle weight in a sort of 2 to 3 month period and use that as an average to understand what's going across that year. But doing it is a slightly complex way of doing it, but that's also reality in terms of those animals will be changing weight, and we've got to choose a weight that's appropriate for that group. So when we talked about demand, and why I find it quite interesting to talk about demand, so kilos of dry matter per hectare, which is driven by the percentage of the body weight they can actually take in as dry matter, is because it's really quickly compared with what grass growth is doing. So the graph that's up on the screen at the moment is this year's data from GrassCheck GB, which is sponsored by the companies you can see at the bottom. And the blue line is last year's growth, so 2019's data. The orange line is what is the average from try to remember the most, I'll come back to you on the numbers, but from the beef and sheep farms across England, Wales and Scotland. And then the green line is the dairy farms. So what we can see from that is that the beef and sheep farms, the yellow line, has generally been always tracking under last year's growth rates. So it's not a surprise when a lot of places we're struggling in terms of the amount of grass that's being grown. The line sort of suggests why. You can also see that dairy farms have also struggled early season, had a really good period and then dropped down when the dry spell came. So if we've got a demand of say 20, grass is growing at 40, we're going to have excess grass, so potentially make it into silage, or we can increase the stocking rate to try and maximise the use of that grass. So it's the information about how much demand we've got with that group, and also how much supply we're coming from grass is quite important bits of information to plan stocking rates. So the other thing we've got to think about as well, which is energy, and I'm doing a lot of theory before we start on the grass bit, but the bit that we've got to consider is that when we're looking at performance of growing and finishing animals, how well they're growing is determined by how much energy they're accessing and their body can use within that day. So for example, for a 400 kilo animal, their maintenance requirement, just basically to stand still, not to grow, just to be present in that field, is 46 megajoules per day. So what we've then got, if we're trying to increase growth rates are increasing to 0.75 kilos, that energy requirement per day is increased to 77 megajoules. If they're gaining a kilo, they're accessing 92 megajoules of energy, and if they're growing at 1.25 kilos per day, they're accessing 112 megajoules. So that's you can see that Unsurprising, as they have access to more energy, their performance will increase, or their weight gain will increase. Animals that are lighter tend to be more efficient, so the difference in terms of sort of between gaining 0.75 to a kilo is narrower than it is as those animals get bigger. They become less efficient as they become bigger animals. Basically, they're putting more energy into maintenance, their larger bodies to support. So that's the thing to think about. So you've got a combination of, as they increase in terms of weight, they become less efficient at using that energy, but we also want them to be able to take as much in as possible to get that weight gain we're after. So we've got to try and, wherever possible, to maximise the amount of megajoules that's presented to those animals so they can digest it and put that performance on. And a lot of the time in growing cattle, we're working on about 2.5% of their body weight. So that could equate, so for a 400 kilo animal, that's 10 kilos of dry matter they're able to take in. There's a bit of range. If it's high quality material, they might take a bit more in. If it's low quality material, they might not take that much in. So at 10 kilos of dry matter per day, to get to 0.75 kilos a day, the concentration of that needs to be 7.7 megajoules, which is sort of hay type material. To get to a kilo, the concentration of the feed that's got to be in front of them has to be 9.2 megajoules. And to get to 1.25 kilos, the concentration of that, or the quality of that material, has to be 11.2 megajoules. So I'm hoping you followed it, but it's just illustrating that quality of the feed in front of them is completely and utterly dictating how well they perform. So then we go forward into thinking about that from a what does the grass look like perspective. So if we've got leafy grass, low stem, low amount of dry dead matter, some clover within that sward, we're looking at grass qualities of anywhere over 11.5 megajoules. So if you think of barley, so being around 12.5 to 13 megajoules, so grass can certainly do 11.5 and certainly can go over 12 in terms of quality of that energy. As we start to build more stem into that, so it could be that it's probably this time of year, so some of those plants have started to head. They've gone through a dry spell, which means there's not as much leafy growth as there was earlier in the spring. We're then reducing quality to probably 10.5 megajoules. And that's just because that leaf has got a bit more lignin. It's not so high in energy. Really good for fibre, which means the benefits in terms of dung quality if you can get them to eat it, but the energy density of that feed has reduced. If we then move again to sort of poor quality stuff, so this is a material that's been allowed to sort of go to seed, potentially not been grazed out well enough multiple times through this year. So we're getting this big buildup of dead material stem, and that's when we get to sort of 8 megajoules, so around 8 megajoules. What's important is that for dry cows or suckler cows or things with lower energy requirements, that feed is perfectly appropriate for them, but it's not what you're going to be finishing or growing animals on. So you've got to then have a estimate of what is the field, what's the quality of the field in front of you, and then what is the potential of those animals. So if we were prioritizing, and we'll come to it in a bit, but prioritizing growing animals, we'd move them on to optimal quality. And then, or if we only had moderate quality grass available, what we might do is do a leader follower system, so push those animals through, the priority animals through first, then take the best bits off, and then follow them up with suckler cows. So we can, understanding the quality of the grass in front of you allows you to then decide what is the best way of getting the best performance of the animals that I've got available to graze that farm or fields. So we've seen, quite a few of you have seen this before, this idea that what we're always trying to do within grazing systems is allow the root reserves of that plant to build up. So rotational grazing systems tend to work best when you're due to that rest and recovery period. So the plant grows to 3 leaves. This is perennial ryegrass based swards, grows to 3 leaves. Animal comes along, harvests it quite effectively, takes all those leaves off, and it resets it back. those animals are moved to the next paddock or field, and then that field is given several weeks to get over it and to grow back up to that 3-leaf stage. By the time the 4th leaf emerges, the 1st leaf dies away, and that's what we're seeing building up in that sort of 8 megajoule poor quality swards that accumulates. So when we look at the bottom of swords, those leaves have just basically gone through this cycle and haven't been eaten, so they've died away and eventually will be taken back into the soil. So that's the principle in terms of rotational grazing systems. We're always trying to do this rest and recovery. Graze it well, get them off as quickly as possible, give it time to recover, and that's what we're getting, sort of 10-15% more growth from those sort of systems and a bit more resilience by having a slightly higher root reserves. But we have to remember in all of this, though, is there's other factors that, I'm banging on about energy, and energy, or the availability of energy, is the primary driver in terms of why those in terms of animal performance. But in terms of grazing animals, we've also got to think about parasite levels. And we've also got to think about trace elements, and both of them indirectly affect the energy that's available for that animal. So parasites, both in terms of they're diverting energy from growth to an immune response, and they're also affecting intake or appetite. And so those animals are actually eating less, therefore taking less energy in, and they're diverting energy onto immune response. So that's why that performance starts to drop. So what we can do is use fecal egg counts to monitor levels of contamination in those fields. We can also do risk maps based on that previous history of that grazing. We can also be monitoring weight gains, and certainly within the sheep sector, targeted selective treatments where those animals are not performing in terms of weight gains, becoming more used in terms of looking at which animals to treat. Again, linking back to having that sort of equipment readily available within beef systems. Trace elements also, by having deficiencies within trace elements, we're also affecting that ability for the animal to use the forage that's been presented to them. So we can look at mineral analysis for forages, which is probably the best place to start. If it's not there, the animals is unlikely to have it. And if you are seeing issues with those forage analysis, then we can look at blood samples, and then we can come up with the appropriate treatment for those animals. In both of these, it's worth engaging with your vet and coming up with a plan. However, I would also plead you to have a chat with your vet in terms of talking with them about the grass availability, because sometimes those animals aren't getting enough trace elements because they're not actually able to eat enough. So performance isn't there because there's not enough energy coming from the grass that's in front of them, or the quality is not there to get them to grow as we expect. So certainly worth talking to your vet through grass quantity, quality, parasites and trace elements if animals are not performing as you would expect. So in terms of, these are common grazing strategies, and we can be talking for hours about the pros and cons of all of them, but I've just highlighted a few. So when we talk in set stocking, and for me that's the sort of idea that you've got a field, you've got a certain number of animals, and you turn them into that field at the beginning of the season, and you pick them out of that field at the end of the season, and you've just let them get on with it. You've not actively managed those sward heights. They've sort of dealt with they've had good grass at certain times, they've tied it up at other times. When we move to continuous stocking, it's actually a very managed form of set stocking. So you could be adjusting the area that those animals have got available to them through use of electric fence, taking a bit of it off for silage, for example, or allowing them to strip graze it back. So it's quite active management of sward height. So we're generally wanting sward heights to be around about 8 centimetres. And so you're adjusting supply and demand by taking certain bits out of that field throughout the year. So it isn't just bunging them on and letting them get on with it. And I think that's important to know, because you can get quite good performance on continuous stocking systems, but this active management of sward height isn't always achieved. And the advantage of that is generally easier. So you're not moving animals as much, potentially get good individual performance because they are able to be a bit non-selective in terms of where they are, selective in terms of where they are, what they're eating. You're likely to get lower utilization and lower growth, and you've got a bit less control of quality. So you still have to actively manage it, but you do have a little bit less control. Rotational grazing is what we tend to see where you've got a series of paddocks or fields that those animals move through and are generally not in that field any longer than 7 days. In an ideal world, they need to be shifting every probably 3 days is the balance for cattle. What you have for that, depending on what your fields are already made up like, is more infrastructure. So you're putting in more fence lines, more water. What you'll get though as a result of that is high yield and high utilization. So the payback is you can get the sort of money back probably within about 2 years of that investment. However, you're also spending more time and labor, I suppose they're the same thing, time and labor in terms of putting or moving animals, putting up fence lines depending on your system. And potentially you might get low individual performance. It doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does. But what you are getting is higher per hectare performance. Again, it's this trade-off between those two things. So you're able to push the stocking rates up, more cattle per hectare, but each cow or each animal may not be doing as much or growing as much as it would be if it was just given a bit more space. Techno grazing is sort of rotational grazing on speed, not quite, but it's got a bit more investment in infrastructure, or quite a bit more investment in infrastructure. The paddocks tend to be smaller, those animals tend to be moved more frequently, and the area is quite accurately adjusted based on how much grass is available to those animals. And you can also use it to sort of ration grass in those times where there isn't quite enough. The cons is high stocking density, which generally isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can be in a wet time, which means it can cause damage. But generally, if those animals are removed from that field quite quickly, that damage is not that severe and it gets over it. Mob grazing. So this is when we start to become, there's lots of terminology here. So when I'm talking about mob grazing, I'm tending to talk about tall grass grazing. So we're going into fields which generally look like they're about ready for sort of slightly mature silage. So we're talking significantly higher than the sort of conventional sward heights that we'll talk about in a second. Within mob grazing, there's two types. There's non-selective and there's selective. And selective is when we're trying to actively encourage that animal to eat a third, trample a third, and leave a third. And that's about building organic matter. The non-selective is when you're trying to get the animal to eat all of that plant to try and get a bit more of a balanced diet and also to improve the sort of quality for the next round. The debates, and we can have a lot of debate about this, but what you tend to see in how we would generally define feed quality, what you're seeing in that is it's lower energy feed. But the advantage of some of those, because it's slightly higher maturity, you get better digestibility, you certainly get better dung quality, and therefore actual ruminate sort of time in the room is longer, and they may be able to extract more of that energy and protein from that crop. So in terms of, there's quite nice evidence on certain systems that animals do very well on it. Some people don't like it, some people do. As someone said the other day, it's a bit like, I won't talk about religion, moving on. So yeah, so mob grazing is an interesting one, which I can pick up more in terms of questions. It's seems to be high, it's very high profile at the moment, but not a huge number of people are doing it, but certainly a lot of the people who are very active in terms of that field. Pun not intended. Right, leader follower we've talked about, which is this idea of you take the priority animal through first and then you follow them around with a slightly lower priority animal, with the ambition that improves quality for that first group, and the second group is on a tidy up job. But as I've mentioned, it needs really careful prioritization. So which of those animals that go first? So this, so for rotational grazing systems, this is sward heights. So this is in centimeters. So we're looking at sort of 10 to 14 roughly centimeters as they go in, and we're looking for sort of between 6 and 8 centimeters roughly as they come out. So that would equate to 2,500 kilos of dry matter per hectare if we were using plate meters or compressed sward sticks, and about 1,800-ish, 1,900 if we were looking at sward sticks. And again, that post-grazing height probably needs to be nearer 6 than 8. In terms of, and then I mentioned this continuous grazing system. So again, this is a very controlled way of grazing. So these sward heights, you're aiming to keep the sward height at a constant. And so early on, we're looking at quite tight ones of sort of 5 to 6, but sort of between 6 and 8 is a reasonable amount or a target for those sort of systems. So that's what 1500 looks like. So it equates to about 4 centimeters. So top of your sort of at your toe level, 2000 at ankle, which equates to sort of 8 to 9 centimeters, probably 2,500 kilos of dry matter looking at above your ankle, and sort of equates to 12 plus. So if cattle were going in at this sort of height, oh, wrong way, sorry, and coming out at this sort of height would be flying. And sometimes if they were high priority stock, you might not ask them to work so hard to take them down to 1500. You might bring them out at 2000 and then ask another class of stock to come and tidy up those fields, depending on what you're trying to achieve with those fields. That's a very grainy picture of techno grazing. So you can see relatively small paddocks, quite high density of animals through that system. And then that's an example on the right hand side of a mob grazing system where herd will lay allowed to express itself in those woods and to get sort of high sward heights, and those animals are being asked to graze a proportion of that and trample a proportion of it into the soil. And so then the debate we've always had, which is this sort of the residual or the amount that's being left behind, and what we always have to think about the residual, it's a trade-off between the animal that we're trying to grow well and the quality of the pasture that's going to come round when we next go back onto that field. So for animals that we're really trying to maximize their growth rate, so growing animals, we may not ask them, as I mentioned, to work so hard and get that residual really tight. But we can ask dry sheep, dry cows, other classes of stock to come around and tidy up. So and that's the flexibility that some beef and sheep systems have, which is we have quite a range of animals types available through the year that can do certain jobs depending on what that field needs. But the key thing is certainly don't ask an animal to work hard if we're trying to get them to grow. So this sort of just illustrates an element of we're trying to find simple systems. So if you want to try sort of different grazing systems, I would always, growing and finishing cattle is actually quite a nice class of animal to try it with, because you can add and take away from them quite easily compared to sort of cows and calves. So certainly it's quite a nice group of animals to try rotational grazing systems with. Just if you haven't quite got the stocking rate right, you can adjust it really simply, and then you can see in terms of the more complex groups in terms of trying different systems. And then in terms of prioritizing, those growing and finishing animals are the highest priority alongside young calves in terms of on a cattle system. They're the animals that we want them to be getting the best bits. We want them to be performing well. And then as we sort of move through, sort of we're reducing priority until we get to the idea of sort of fat dry stock, and they're the ones that we can ask to work hard, tidy up those poorer quality fields and get the quality back for the growing and finishing cattle that are coming next potentially. And then what's interesting this year is that we're now probably going into a phase where grass is growing too quickly for the amount of animals we've got on the farm compared to 2 weeks ago when we didn't have quite enough. But there are some options in terms of if the grass is growing too quickly, we can bring in another group. So it could be that you bring in a group from a different area of the farm. It could be that you add a sheep group to a cow group or vice versa. You can do some strip grazing where you section off a proportion of the field and then allow them access to it, so you're rationing that field back to them. Works better when when you've got grass that's slightly slowing. So if it's really quick grass growth, by the time you get to the other side of the field in strip grazing, it might have gone too far. You can set up again later in the season, you can start to set up deferred grazing systems where you are, once that during the field's been really nicely cleaned out, you can set it up ready for sort of winter grazing or later autumn grazing. Silage is always an option, and then potentially you can leave those field bales in the field for bale grazing later in the winter. Again, not necessarily right now, but certainly within the next month or so, those are some of the options that would come in terms of setting up fields for deferred and bale grazing. And then used more commonly within the dairy sector, this sort of you're mowing it before grazing. So you're basically going in, you've potentially got seed heads or rejection areas. You're mowing that site and then allowing through a strip graze for those animals to eat it off. And it could be that within sort of 12-24 hours of a slight wilt, they have a greater preference to tidy that up. It relies on them being restricted access, so they do it sort of on a tidy up job. And this is probably more applicable to about a month ago. So if the grass was growing too slowly, it's all about trying to reduce the demand per hectare. So we've either got to allow more area to come back into that a rotation, so we could either graze silage ground or we can add in another paddock from somewhere else magically as these things happen. A lot of people are starting to feed supplements, so that could be hay or concentrate, anything that supplements that grass. Or we can try and reduce number of animals, and we can house stock that are close to finishing, or we can potentially sell depending on the time of season and what the markets are doing. And we also have to accept a slower growth rate, so we're actually allocating less dry matter to those animals, and therefore their performance won't be where we possibly need it to be. The advantage we also saw in those drier times is that actually parasites were less of a problem, so some of that had some benefit in terms of animal performance. So the other thing, and we'll just move to the last bit, which is this idea of finishing animals. Why? A common question is why animals won't finish at grass. And what we have to consider, and this is coming out of the AHD book, Growing and Finishing Cattle, which there's an image of at the end. So in the growing phase, this idea of we're trying to get frame growth, we're actually trying to limit the amount of starch in that diet, and that's to try and ensure that those animals don't get too fat at too light a weight. So we're trying to get their frame to grow. And so what we tend to do is have higher protein within those diets, and that's why grass systems work really well in that growing phase. But you can see that during the targets are sort of where we want them to be, where we've talked about earlier. In the finishing phase, I know there's a lot of, it's a switch in terms of the crude protein drops. So we're moving away from frame growth, and then the energy density increases, and that we're trying to get more of that energy in the form of starch, and that's what encourages that fat to be laid down. As I've mentioned before, in those early maturing animals, or the more sort of British type breeds, their ability, they're genetically more prone to put fat down. So during this starch component of the diet might not be quite as big a factor as we do when we're trying to finish continental type animals at grass. But again, as we've mentioned before, this finishing phase has this really sort of high sort of daily live weight gain target, so this short, sharp finishing period. But it's thinking about the starch, and that's what grass systems don't tend to have huge amounts of starch in them. A lot of the energy within grass is stored as sugars rather than starch, and so those finishing diets tend to consist of things like grains or cereals, which has this high starch component. So I think we can finish animals at grass. We just have to be we have to think about the breed, the gender of those animals, and what is the likelihood of them finishing at grass, and actually do they need a bit of support. And so this is just to think about, and this is not me saying everything needs to be fed cereals at grass, but for certain animals that haven't performed as well as you'd expect, or slightly below where they need to be, or of a certain breed type that don't lay down fat as easily, it could be that you're supplementing with 0.5 kilo per 100 kilos of live weight per feed. That didn't make any sense. So for every 100 kilos that those animals weigh, you're giving them 0.5 kilo. So for a 400 kilo animal, that would be giving them 2 kilos per day. So it's not a huge amount in terms of in terms of their intake. However, if the grass quality or quantity is low, it might be that supplementation needs to increase to 1 kilo per 100 kilos of live weight per feed. So in that situation, we'd be looking at 4 kilos for that 400 kilo animal, and we'd want them to be over 2 feeds during that day, just to reduce the risk of acidosis. In all of this, we have to remember the 1 to 2 to 3 ratio. So grazed grass being 1. As soon as you put anything in a bale or a clamp involving tractors and people, you double the cost. And then as soon as you have to make a telephone phone call to someone and it has to be delivered on farm, it's probably at least 3 times the cost of grazed grass. So before we start supplementing at grass, we've also got to think about what else can we do. Is it just a crutch to get us through, or could we have done something differently? And there is a situation is that those animals could be housed, but then you've got issues or costs associated with straw, machinery, all of those factors around housing. So it could be that for a small amount of time they're being basically finished at grass, there's some supplements going in for the last few weeks, and that's how you get those animals off that grass. But certainly for certain breed types and certain genders, the element of supplementation of starch-rich feeds may not be necessary. So in terms of, to summarise, we've got to think about your targets and how to monitor them. And I know the monitoring is the most challenging part of sort of growing cattle at grass, is the sort of logistics of getting them weighed. We've got to identify the quality of the grass that's there and the potential growth rate. So if you've got high quality and the growth rates aren't performing, what else? Is there anything else happening within that field on those animals? We've got to select the most appropriate grazing type, and that is always the most difficult question. So that's dependent on what resources you've got available, the types of fields you've got available, if you want to spend your time moving electric fencing or not. And this, as we've mentioned, there's pros and cons of all of it, and it has to fit in terms of what is your objective for that field and your farm. And then consider whether supplementation at grass is needed. And as I mentioned, that's to do with breed and gender, but also can be quite useful if you know that those animals are going to be transitioned to more intensive diets when they are housed. So it's also can be an important element of that transition. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Liz. So we've got a few questions. I'd just like to say that the presentation has been recorded, so it will be available to watch back on the AHDB YouTube channels. We've also got a fairly new series of web pages on rotational grazing cattle. And I'll send the link around to these afterwards in the follow-up email, along with links to the manuals that Liz has highlighted. And these are also available in hard copy. So Liz, the first question, this person says they always get a significant weight loss or lack of gains after turnout in the spring, so little or no growth over the first 4 to 6 weeks when going from silage to grass. They've tried to buffer with silage to smooth the transition in the diet, but it's tough to get the cattle to take the silage when they've got the grass there. Any suggestions to avoid this dead time?
I need to ask a qualifying question. So part of it would be the height of grass that they're going into. So yeah, so in that transitional element, we're assuming that rumen takes between 2 to 4 weeks to adjust to that new diet. So that would explain a proportion of that sort of no gain period there. So we've also got to think about the sward heights those animals are going into. Sometimes the people have a tendency to put animals out or with quite high sward heights, so you've got and potentially lush grass. So it's actually quite challenging for them to actually take as much energy in as possible. So it depends in terms of it's almost better to put them out when grass is slightly shorter. It depends also in terms of obviously the carrying capacity and what else is happening, but it is trying to get them out when it's slightly shorter might help that transitional period, but expect there will be a 2 to 4 week sort of adaptation phase as they transition. And I appreciate that, Jean, and also the advantage of taking them out when it's slightly shorter and almost the grass is growing to them is they might have a greater tendency to take some silage as buffer if it's there.
Thanks, Liz. The next question is, this person says that for them, grazing at the 2.5 to 3 leaf stage can be a lot shorter than the recommended sward heights. What would your comment be on that?
So what's brilliant about grass is that it will adapt to how it's been grazed in the past. So generally, especially if there's sheep within that system and it tends to be grazed slightly shorter, that 3 leaf stage if we go the extreme on sheep grazed pasture, you can get to the 3 leaf stage at sort of 4 to 6 centimetres. So it depends on how that grass has been grazed in the passed that will affect at what height will it get to those 3 leaf stages. The important thing we're trying to get to with cattle is how they eat is by putting their tongue round the grass and ripping it in. So they do, that's the core part of how they graze. So in terms of, it's important there is some sward height there. However, it's sort of a balancing act between the 3. As soon as you go over the 3 leaf stage, you might be losing quality if you had to wait to the sward height to get to what the magic target would say. So I would say go for the 3 leaf stage as long as there is enough sward height for them to be able to exhibit that ripping and behaviour in terms of how they eat it.
Thanks. And the next question is, if you do suspect that you have got a trace element deficiency at grass, when would you suggest to blood sample stock? Would it be pre or post calving?
So what the key thing is with that is you're trying to get them, probably a couple of the times a year would be useful, and you're trying to get them at least probably 2 months from when they've experienced any last form of supplementation. So if you are feeding anything in the shed, if they're in a shed, if you're feeding any hard feed that's got some minerals in them, or they've got access to free access minerals, or they've been bolused, or all of that, you're looking for a period when they've been at grass for probably around about 2 months. So you're trying to get a level which is sort of a base level for that is what their blood levels are like when they've been at grass with no supplementation for a couple of months. The challenge is that you need to sort of establish that baseline before you're in a sort of high risk period, which is around calving, around bulling. So that's the other, so it's always a trade-off between when you need the piece of information. So if you need to put a bolus in, it's active and working at that time of requirement. So certainly, if you're just trying to get a baseline for what's happening at your farm, a mid-season blood sample's quite good time because they've been on grass for quite a few months, potentially not had any supplementation for a while, and that gives you some good baselines. If, as I mentioned before, if there is a bit of uncertainty about about blood sampling, then a forage analysis is a nice place to start. Can be done easily, no vet. I mean, it's slightly more similar-ish price to a silage sample, and can be done quite quickly. So yeah, thinking about when you last supplemented to try and get what is your baseline, and then if you have supplemented quite recently but you need an answer in terms of what's happening in terms of forages, then a forage sample for minerals could be a useful place to start.
Thanks, Liz. The next question is, what daily live weight gain should I benchmark with weaned Limousin beef calves on a reseeded perennial ryegrass with clover?
Wowzer, very specific question. So what we would very much be aiming for over a kilo, and because they're younger animals, you would trying to get to 1.2, but it depends on, as we sort of mentioned before, this transition period, so getting them used to it. If they're also used to they might be moving into a sort of rotational grazing type system. Are they used to it? So it will take them some time to get through that transition, but yeah, certainly you would be expecting them to do over a kilo, if not 1.2.
Thanks, Liz. And the next question is, what target N rate are you suggesting? And following on from that, would you stock for average grass growth or overstock and rely on fertilizer to grow grass?
So then, interesting question about nitrogen. So I suppose a question back, which is a hypothetical question back, is how much grass you want to grow. So we know that it's a very straight line between the amount of nitrogen applied and grass performance. So it depends in terms of how much grass you're growing. RB209 guidance in graze systems is probably 30-ish kilos of nitrogen per grazing. So it then debate how many grazings you have over that season. So that's the sort of rough guidance from RB209. In terms of stocking rate, I suppose it's a bit dependent on if you're in I know this year was strange, but if you are in a area with generally reliable rainfall, so you aren't summer dry, for example, you would tending to be stocking slightly over an average stocking rate and then using fertilizer to adjust it as necessary, or potentially using housing stock or adjustment of silage area to adjust for that if it's not growing as much. But certainly, yeah, you're trying to challenge that system by pushing up that stocking rates. And the reality is that if you think to the sort of spring block dairy systems, they're very much getting stocking rates of sort of 2.5 probably livestock units per hectare. And they probably work on average a 1 in 10 year sort of situation where that they can't quite achieve that. So for some of them this year is where they've been feeding quite a lot of concentrates and silage into those systems. So you have to, if you are just going to be pushing up your stocking rates higher, you have to have a plan B and appreciate that some years it's going to cost you money. In other years, it'll make you a lot of money.
Thanks, Liz. And the next question is, what is the average benefit of rotational grazing compared to set stocking in terms of kilos of live weight gain per hectare?
That's an interesting one. So what I'll answer it in a different way. So what we're generally relying upon is that we probably have a 20% increase in grass growth on a rotational grazing system, and that's through that rest and recovery period. And then in terms of utilization, we probably add another 10-ish% onto that. So we might be growing a third more grass per hectare, therefore stocking rate should be a third higher. So that's not answering your question, because as I've mentioned before, as we push those stocking rates up, so we might be increasing them by 30%-ish, that individual performance might not be tracking alongside that. So in a set stocking, we'd still be trying to get towards the 1 kilo, but in a set stocking or continuous grazing system where they are able to access the, have more choice, they might be getting slightly higher growth rates. So I would still think on a per hectare performance, we're looking at sort of anywhere between 20 to 30% higher on a rotational grazing system. That I may have worked well. I need some time to work it out actually, but that's my gut feel.
Thanks, Liz. And are you aware of any feed products that enhance grass digestibility and improve daily live weight gain in cattle?
So in terms of palatability, we know that application of salt, agricultural salt, onto grass will increase its palatability. Animals have that salt-seeking behaviour. In terms of live weight gain, so what we're trying to get first is that high quality grass that's always in front of them, that sort of 11.5, 12 ME grass. The challenge is the only thing that's going to be higher in energy to that is cereals that you can buy in, which we've talked about is sometimes applicable, sometimes not, depending on what stage those animals are at. But I think instead of what we're always trying to do in these systems is actually buy in less stuff. So what the first thing to do is get the grass as good as it can be, and then start to tweak things. But certainly the cheapest way of getting energy down the throat of an animal is a good grazing system, not buying stuff in.
Thanks, Liz. And the next question is, how should we prioritise turnout? So do you go for younger, lighter cattle, which do less damage in the wet, but they're vulnerable to the cold, wet weather? Or do you go for heavier cattle, which are closer to finishing, but could have a growth check at and after turnout? So which age order to turnout?
So in terms of any animals that are sort of probably within 50 to 80 kilos of finishing, you wouldn't go anywhere near. You'd keep them in sheds, just as we've said, as the questioner said, in terms of that the check that happens at turnout. In terms of lighter animals, it depends a bit on ground conditions. So generally, our preference is for lighter animals. If the ground conditions are wetter, they tend to do less damage. But it could be that it's sort of the mid-range ones that you're trying to turn out. So it's not the smallest ones, because of, as mentioned, in terms of the concerns about weather, it's actually the mid-range one. But certainly in terms of trying to avoid soil damage, you are always aiming for those lighter animals. And I think the other thing about turnout is that it doesn't have to be the same date for every animal on your farm. So it is about putting out a small amount, getting them used to that, eating that grass, checking the level of damage, and then if necessary you can bring them back in, which everyone feels like it's some sort of failure, but that is the reality of as you're pushing that earlier turnout, sometimes those animals have to come back in for their own benefit, but sometimes for the grass's benefit because they're just doing too much damage.
Thanks, Liz. And the next one here is the native breeds of cattle are much more suited to grazing without supplementary feeding. Do you find that their financial performance shows this over a grazing season?
So I think there are some, during the later maturing continentals, there are animals or certain lines of those animals that can achieve really good growth rate and put an appropriate level of fat cover on. But generally this, they might need a bit more help nearer that, in that finishing phase. So what the counter to that is they will be getting to higher carcass weights. So in terms of the value per animal will be higher than the potentially smaller native or British type breeds. But yeah, it's always to do with that, the trade-off between how much supplementation those larger animals are needed and if they need extra shed space or extra wintering space because they need to be on farm a couple of weeks or months, sorry. So yeah, so I think the general principle is an animal that can be off grass with minimal inputs, both in terms of feed and wintering costs, the better. But we can't forget that those carcasses from those later maturing animals will be valuing more because they're just heavier.
Thanks, Liz. And next question is, if you chase maximum utilization of grass, does the extra burden of parasites and trace elements and what goes along with managing these systems, does that make more sense to actually go less intensive in terms of the bottom line?
I think, and it is an important question. No, there is, as ever, obviously trade-off is my favourite word today, but there is a trade-off. So as we push those stocking rates up, there is a greater risk of the wheels falling off, I suppose. The parasites, what's interesting about parasites is that on a rotational grazing system, sometimes it helps because they're moving away from those contaminated pastures. Sometimes as they move back into that field, it's just prime opportunity for those larvae to be ingested by those animals. So obviously as you increase the stocking rate, you're forcing animals to eat tighter or closer or improving utilization, you are likely to be increasing the risk of them ingesting parasites. The trace element is also driven by actually what is the trace element content of the grasses, and that's both of them can be dealt with by a proactive health plan that deals with trace elements and also monitoring for parasites. But I think there's probably a sweet spot that isn't extremely like the highest intensity is probably not where we want to be, but we can probably challenge quite a lot of our systems a bit more than they currently are. But certainly I wouldn't want very high stocking rates can be challenging to manage and can be expensive in a year where grass isn't growing.
Thanks, Liz. And the next question is, if you were to sample grass for trace elements, when would you do it?
So it can be done, again, similar to blood samples, it can be done multiple times in a year. What they're really finding is there's a bit of difference depending on what's happening in terms of the dry. So summertime, it's a bit drier. A lot of the minerals gets on the grass from soil or dust. So there's a bit of variation that happens during the year, just because how the plant takes up those minerals, but also the amount of mud and the dust that's basically on those plants. So again, probably a mid-season one would be useful as a bit of a benchmark. And then it could be that you're also doing a mineral analysis on your silage, because obviously that's quite a good proportion of the diet as well. But yeah, a mid-season one just to get a bit of a benchmark of what's happening on your farm is useful. They can be quite difficult, very difficult to interpret. So that's why it's useful to engage with people who are a bit more experienced in terms of how you interpret those samples, and obviously be careful of people who are helping you interpret it that also sell minerals. But yeah, just a mid-season one can be quite useful, but the more you can do during that year, or the better the picture is in terms of how the availability changes.
Thanks, Liz. And the next one is, you mentioned optimum sward quality with the images earlier on, but does this image differ between finishing and growing cattle with regard to optimizing the starch or protein?
Interesting question. So I would, so in terms of protein, those sort of swards would also be sort of getting quite high in protein. So we tend to, it's very difficult to sort of get to the levels we're seeing in a housed finishing diet in a grass-based system, just because we tend to always have excessive protein. I suppose a way to do that is a dilution effect. So by getting that plant to be slightly maturer, and that's potentially dropping the protein down a little bit, but that obviously also reduces the energy density. So in terms of starch, the challenge we've always got with grasses is that they just don't store sugars in the form of starch. So it's really difficult to sort of to increase their starch levels, just because as a plant they don't tend to do it, or they don't do it.
Thanks, Liz. And the next question is, are there any plants which should be included in the pasture to increase the ME of the pasture other than clover?
So there's obviously a lot of interest in herbal lays at the moment. So plantain, chicory being probably the most commonly sown ones within that diverse sward. And certainly they've got similar MEs to clover, really. So 11.5 plus really, if well managed. Protein probably, well, slightly lower than clover. But yeah, they're useful in terms of energy, and they're bringing in different components into that diet as well. But certainly well managed ryegrass does an amazing job in terms of energy.
Thanks, Liz. Just a couple of questions left and then we'll be out of time. What are your thoughts on growing dairy cross beef cattle at grass, and can they achieve the target weight gains that we've discussed tonight?
So I think the challenge with all those sort of animals is also in terms of how good has their start been, really, in terms of what their growth rates have been early in that sort of rearing phase almost. In terms of those live weight gains, I think certainly what I didn't really talk about was how those live weight gains might shift over the season, and that's really determined by sort of how that grass quality shifts. So certainly early season, when you've got high quality grass, certainly those live weight targets are very achievable on those types of animals. The challenge becomes when is managing the quality of those pastures as we go from sort of mid-season onwards, to ensure that the energy levels are good enough. So I think it's back to that. If we can get the energy into them, they should respond in terms of the growth rates from the table we've shown earlier. Our challenge is to get that grass to be at the right quality and then presented to them appropriately.
Thanks, Liz. The final question is there a correlation between protein and sugar levels in grass? Does one drop as the other rises, or is it more in relation to the varieties?
So they're two separate things within that plant. So protein levels is a lot more driven by nitrogen. So in terms of, you can push the nitrogen up within grasses by as we apply nitrogen fertilizer, or if there's clover available, we will improve the nitrogen, the crude protein within the plant. In terms of energy content, there's an element of genetics. So people may be familiar with high sugar grasses. They've been selected for having this higher water soluble carbohydrate content. But the sugar levels within it, or the energy levels in it, is dependent but on the stage that grass is in, so how much leaf is there, and also how efficient it is at converting sunlight into energy, because that's where the energy comes from. So the greater the leaf area, the higher levels of that sugars will be in those leaves, and hopefully moving from the leaves and going into the roots, and then that's what drives the sort of root reserves. So they're not, there isn't that quite clear relationship. They're driven by different factors, energy being driven by sunlight, stage of plant growth, protein being driven by the amount of nitrogen that's in that system, and slightly about what stage of growth those plants are in.
Thanks, Liz. That's great. And we are just about out of time now. So apologies to those we've not quite managed to get through all your questions tonight. Liz, thanks very much for your time this evening.
No, enjoyed it.
And thanks to everyone at home for listening. The webinar has been recorded, so it will be available on the HDB Dairy and the HDB Beef and Lamb YouTube channels, along with other previous webinars. So thanks again, and have a good evening, everyone.